Next presenter is Yamil Almonte. Yamil is a double major in philosophy and English at Rowan, and she will be presenting her work entitled Understanding Cultures and Cultural Appropriation.
So, in trying to figure out how we understand cultures, we also have to have a definition of what a culture is. And when we do that, we can always span across the world, which I will not do today. That's a little bit too much. But I'll stick to the USA and how we define culture and how we view culture and how how US culture is a little distinct from other countries, maybe. So, in the USA, a large part of culture includes how we treat each other and our history. So we do have this history of slavery, we do have this history of oppression, and that ties into how we view culture and how we protect culture as well, which is where cultural appropriation comes to be, because cultural appropriation is defined as the appropriation of elements of a subordinated culture by a dominant culture without substantive reciprocity, permission, and or compensation. And when we define culture itself, culture is usually defined by the way people dress, their music they listen to, hair, and other aesthetic features. So when I first started researching this subject, I read a book by James J. Winchester, who introduces the question of, is it possible to understand art across cultural borders? And he proposes questions in his book, Aesthetics Across the Color Line. Now, my problem with this isn't whether it is possible to understand art or whether we can do it accurately or not. I don't think that's as much of a factor in cultural appropriation as what that type of thought and reasoning opens the door to. So Winchester writes that when crossing cultural borders into poorly known terrain, we should exercise extreme caution about our ability to understand others better than they understand themselves. And I thought was very important to cultural appropriation, because usually cultural appropriation means taking ownership of something that you can't really take ownership of. So going back to our history and how we view culture, we have to remember that in America, with the history of oppression and the history of othering of people in this country, especially when they first arrive, that creates stronger bonds to culture. Because if you're gonna take a group of people and separate them until you find them palatable, I guess that's the right way to say it, or until you find something about them that you can ingrain into yourself, they're obviously gonna become a lot more possessive of these things, and they're gonna bring that up more. And when we do this, when we take ownership of something, we're not taking ownership, we're not including people or including cultures, we're just taking different aspects of things, which is what adds further insult to this issue. So from this, I also have to bring in feminist standpoint theory, which asserts that all attempts to know are socially situated. So anything we know comes from our experiences and our past. And going with this is also an example of this would be So an example of this would be understanding. Well, Terry Elliott offers the example of person A approaches a building and enters it unproblematically. As she approaches, she sees something perfectly familiar, which, if asked, she might call the entrance. Now, another person comes up to the same entrance of the same building, and all they see is a great stack of stairs and the glaring lack of a ramp for a wheelchair. So that's kind of how it's approached. So when we look at other cultures, we might see something aesthetically appealing, or such as art, colors, maybe even just food, and that's what we see. But when a person within that culture, what they see is history, what they see is knowledge, what they've learned from childhood up to now, and how that has been and how they react towards that. Which also was the question of who owns culture. How can we say that one particular person or group owns this aspect of culture instead of another? And how, when we make claims of cultural appropriation, can we make them concrete, I guess, would be a way to put it. So, although instances of cultural appropriation are not new, we see them more and more now with media and the new ways in which we give marginalized groups voices to be heard, and how that's becoming more and more popular. So in her book, The Commodification of Culture, Susan Scafidi writes that that some cultural products can be freely shared with the public, while others are devalued when appropriated by the majority culture. And to consider the distinction between popularizing a Caribbean dance rhythm and secretly recording and distributing a Native American sacred chant. The abstraction of a dance rhythm from its cultural life world, whether via a market system or an intellectual property system that permits unfettered copying, may not severely harm either the source community or the cultural product itself. By contrast, the appropriation of a secret or sacred cultural product is more likely to cause damage, even when voluntary contributions to popular culture are subject to gross distortion. Can Mexican national cuisine be faithfully represented by Taco Bell? The large-scale cultural industry is perennially under attack for its tendency to simplify and standardize to the detriment of authentic culture or artistry. So on that note, German scholars Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno wrote that pseudo-individually is rife, from the standardized jazz improvisation to exceptional film star whose hair curls over her eyes to demonstrate originality. To them, cultural conformity raised the specter of fascism. In the realm of cultural appropriation, replacement of homemade tortillas or the small neighborhood taqueria with a mass market product or chain store may create a barrier to cultural identity and national diversity. So a lot of times when we make claims of appropriation, they might be seen as unsubstantial because it's usually not something tangible. We don't really have laws in place to protect cultural appropriation. What we do have is laws in place to protect individuals. But how can individuals be a voice for a large community? And so, Susan Scafidi also writes that without a legal structure, we have no framework for discussion of meaning and normative use, dispute resolution, or even recognition of conflicting values. A system that formally acknowledged the relationship between source communities and their cultural products could provide these benefits, either through extension of the limited ownership concept expressed in an intellectual property law, or through trademark-style recognition of a constructed legal authority. So when acts of appropriation occur, there's nothing more that we can do than to bring attention to them and to enforce education about them and education about ourselves. Because acts of appropriation usually involve either consequences to the individuals whose cultures are being stolen monetarily or social, there should be consequences that can be levied against them when they occur. So while I do believe that these would be difficult to do, doing so would decrease the amount of harm being done to the communities. That's all I have. Any questions?
So from what I'm understanding, your message was that other, and correct me if I'm wrong, other cultures, when they try to replicate or somehow incorporate other cultures of other societies, then they often alter them and therefore like disrespect them or like misrepresent them in a way, and that's wrong.
That is the point I was making. I think it's also there's a very important historical and social aspect to cultural appropriation that's often negated or ignored, because a lot of times when people think of appropriation, they think of like, well, they either think of cultural appreciation or they think of appropriation as like, well, we're America, we're this melting pot of cultures and we can share and it's all love, which isn't really the case when you're only taking a specific aspect of a culture and ignoring the people.
Yes. So bear with me, this is kind of a half-baked thought, but I'm curious to know where, like, what your definition of culture is as far as, like, are there limitations that we can put on how we define a culture and who belongs to a culture? I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's one of the biggest difficulties with cultural appropriation, because it's very hard to say that you belong to a specific culture or that you don't. Usually when a lot of people make these claims, it's usually something with bloodlines or just how you were raised.
If we then are kind of restricted to our own cultures, or at least we have to fully understand and like grasp the other cultures, how could we advance with new ideas, and how could we share one another's ideas and cultures if we can't, I guess, adapt them to ourselves? If that makes sense.
It does, and I don't think it's about restricting culture. It's usually with cultural appropriation, these claims are made because there's no, I guess it's like when you write a paper and you don't cite your sources type of thing. That's usually when it becomes an issue, and it's also because it usually ends up with other people either perpetuating stereotypes or, again, ruining aspects or just picking up one or two things. It's kind of like if you're going to accept this culture, you have to accept all of it and understand where it comes from, the history and the knowledge of it, and respect it. So cultural appropriation claims usually come when there's no respect, there's no like, it's usually somebody presenting some aspect of a culture as its own original idea.
And what about if they conflict then, once they do understand one of those cultures? What if they conflict, for example, with different religions of different cultures? What would you advise of that?
I think there's always supposed to be this mutual respect, which is what is missing when cultural appropriation happens. It's usually a disrespectful act in and of itself. And I think even with different religions, there's always this mutually understood, like, I understand where you're coming from and I see it kind of thing, but I don't necessarily. It's a little bit different with religion, because religion is so yes or no. I don't think you could necessarily disagree with a person's culture. You might just say that's not really something I see, or like you might not be aware of it, but you can't disagree with culture in that sense, I guess. That's what I would say.
Because America has been a country of immigrants since its very beginning, transitioning from mass amounts of Italians immigrating to Irish, to Germans, to many others, and their cultures just blending in with ours just over generations through more integration. How do we specifically draw the line between cultural appropriation and what is, I guess, would be referred to as cultural assimilation?
Okay. That's good to me a minute to answer. I know the answer, but to word it correctly. Well, I think cultural appropriation is socially situated as well. It's not really it's something that happens from time to time, and there's always a negative, or there's always a targeted set of people, I guess would be the right way to say it. So, for example, we are a country that has had a long history of immigration, but it's not always welcomed immigration. Most of the time it's not, even with Italians and Irish. They weren't originally accepted, and their exception into the mainstream culture, to the dominant culture, also came as a result of the oppression, or the further oppression of African Americans. If that answers the question, I guess.
Maybe slightly related, but I was just sort of thinking about the boundaries between sort of problematic cultural appropriation and then examples that might be more complicated. So I was thinking of, like, if you go down to New Orleans or something, you're enjoying the food there, right? There's a ton of appropriation that's gone on to sort of what we think of now as a very authentic culture, right? Is the product of, French Acadians and African Americans, because it's a port town, all these sort of international influences. And I suspect there was a lot of disrespect going on in how things were taken, or, at various stages. But then it becomes its own sort of thing that becomes valuable, like in a weird way. Like, so something of value could come out of these sort of maybe problematic appropriations. So it's just, I feel like sometimes that's a more complicated picture, like it's sort of
Yeah.
Taco Bell, yeah, I get it, that's terrible. But there's more complicated cases too, and I'm just sort of curious your thoughts on those sorts of things.
See, with that, I wouldn't necessarily, I don't know if my answer is going to be completely accurate because I don't know the history of New Orleans like that, but I would consider it as some sort of along the lines of appreciation, which is also possible. And when it's just a mixing of cultures in that way, it's a little bit different than, because I think at some point it becomes something new. Like what we see as cultural appropriation today, I'm not sure we'll see it that way in 10 years. And what we point to directly as cultural appropriation today, I don't think we'll point that way in 10 years. So it's not really like today and forever, it's usually today and for now.
I was just gonna quickly ask if, I'm just thinking about how cultures were actually formed, and I'm wondering how they were not formed by cultural appropriation, meaning that wherever they did originate, that they took ideas and they took possibly misinterpreted or maybe not fully appreciated cultures of other cultures and maybe made their own cultures in a way so that now when we're doing that today, so you're saying that is a problem. Does that make
I know what you're saying, but I don't think that's necessarily the right way in what I'm saying, because I do think, again, this is super socially situated, and it's socially situated to America specific and America's history. So I think that does play a very large role in how we view the world and how we view appropriation, because it's kind of like in America specifically, cultural appropriation comes at the result of not accepting different cultures, but accepting specific aspects of cultures without accepting the people. And I think that's where that kind of differs in a sense than it would 1,500 years ago more, or even in a different country as well, because we go to different countries and we experience different cultures, and that's usually seen on cultural appreciation because you're going there, you're learning, and you're appreciating when you see the food, the clothes, the people.